In this video, we'll create a transparent login form with HTML and CSS. Okay guys, so let's take a look at the login form here before we get started. So as you can see, we have the user image at the top, and then we have the enter email field where we can enter the email, and we'll need to have a valid email address. And then we have the icons to the left of the email and password field, and when the password is entered, it's going to enter as the dots there showing that it's encrypted. And then of course we have the login button underneath, and then the forgot password link. And as we can see, when we size it down, it's going to be responsive and respond to smaller screen widths. So in the description of this video will be the HTML and CSS login form starter files that you see here with index.html and style.css. I'm going to be using the free program called Sublime Text as my text editor, and then I'll have Google Chrome open as my browser while we're building the login form. So in the image folder, we'll have the two images that we need to complete the tutorial also inside of that download. Okay, so let's go over to Sublime Text to see what's already included for us here in index.html, and then we'll go over to style.css. So at the top we have our doc type HTML, then we of course have the HTML tag spanning the whole document, and inside of that we have the head section at the top where we tell the web browser how we want the website to display, starting with the title of the website, and then we have a link underneath that to the latest version of Bootstrap CSS as of the making of this video. Then we have the latest version of jQuery, which is needed to operate Bootstrap, and then we have bootstrapmin.js, followed by a link to Font Awesome, which will allow us to display these icons right here inside of the form, and then we have a link to style.css, which is right here, where we have a Google font added called Railway, which is referenced right here for the font family. And then we have our font weight specified at 600, followed by the background image already added for us. And we have that set to cover the entire page. Okay, so if we go ahead and open up index.html, let's just make sure we have it linked to Google Chrome, which was right here, and we already have the background image displaying, and there's the text that I just typed in. And one other thing I'd like to mention before we get started is if you're unfamiliar with Bootstrap, which we reference with the files, Bootstrap is a CSS framework that makes it easier for us to lay out some of the elements because it has CSS already built into it. If you want to learn more about Bootstrap, I'll add a link in the video description to my Bootstrap course. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our first tag, which is going to be a div class, which will create the modal that we're seeing displaying on top of the background image. So we're going to say div class modal-dialog, and this is a Bootstrap class which allows a section to sit right on top of everything else behind it, as we see right here. And then since all of our text is centered, we'll use another Bootstrap class called text-center. Then we can drop down and close out the div. And inside of that, we're going to go ahead and specify the width that we want our modal to be, or at least the content inside of it. So we're going to use a Bootstrap column, and we're going to say div class col-9, and then we're going to use a class that we'll make up called main-section, which will allow us to style the modal later on. Alright, then inside that we just need one more class before we actually add our content inside of the modal, and so we can start to see the layout of it, and that's going to be div class modal-content. And then drop down and close out the div, and now we should be able to start to see the shape of the modal take form, as we can see right here at the top. So let's go ahead and start off with the user image that's at the top of the modal content, and that's going to be the face.png image. So let's start it off with div class user-image, which isn't a Bootstrap class, that's just a class that we're making up. And then inside of that we'll have our image with image source. And since we're inside of the image folder, as we see right here, it's going to be img/face.png. Okay, so now we can go ahead and save it, and let's take a look at it over here. So there we have the image, and as you can see, the background for the modal is white right now, but we'll change that later. So now let's drop down and let's add the next bit, which will be our actual form. So we're going to use a column inside of the modal content to create some padding around the side. So we'll say col-12 and then form-input to create our form. And then that's going to add the padding, as you can see right here, off to the sides. And then inside of the form input class, we'll have the actual form HTML5 tag. And then we'll have div class form-group, which we'll have for each part of the form input, starting with the email input first that you see right here. So we'll use the input tag, and we'll say input type email. And then for the class for inputs, we'll use the class form-control. And then for the placeholder text, we're just going to write enter email, as we can see right there. So enter email. And then we already have the div closed for the form group. So we can drop down and create the next form group, which will be for the password form control. So let's go ahead and add our next input now that we have the email input added, which will be the enter password one. So once again, we'll use the input tag and we'll say type password, and then we'll give it the same class, which is form-control. And then for the placeholder text, instead of enter email, we'll just have enter password. And you can really enter whatever you want right there for the placeholder text. Okay, so now that we have those filled out, let's drop down to the login button. So just underneath the last closing div for the form group, we'll add a button, and we'll say type submit, and then we'll give it a class, and that's just going to be btn. So if we want, we can add a Bootstrap class, and I'm just going to write login, because right now it's just going to display as sort of a blank login text right there. But if we wanted to use a Bootstrap button class, we can do btn-secondary, for example, which will give us a gray button, as we can see right there. But because we're adding all custom styling to the button, we'll just use class btn, and we'll style it later with the CSS. Okay, so now that we have our form added completely, the last thing that we'll add here will be the forgot password section. So let's put that in its own div class, which we can style later, and we'll just call that forgot, and then we'll have a link, and we'll just use a hashtag because we're not going to send it anywhere right now with the link for forgot password, and then we'll just write forgot password question mark, and then we can close out our link. Okay, so now if we refresh, there we have all of our content laid out for the form, and the rest of it will be taken care of in style.css as we style it. Okay, so since we have the body already styled, let's drop down to the main section div class to style that. And what we're going to do is we're just going to change the positioning to add some padding on the top and to make sure that it's centered on the page, or some margin on the top rather. So let's reference that main section class with .main-section, and then we'll say margin 0 auto, which will make sure that it's centered on the page at all times. And if we refresh it, it's going to position it a little bit more to the right, and then we're just going to say margin top 130 pixels to create some space above it. And now it should match up pretty good with the original. And then the last thing that we'll do with the main section is there's a little bit of padding around it inherently, so we'll do away with that. So we'll say padding 0, and that will allow it to display at its full width. As you can see right there, it got a little bit wider. So now let's drop down to the next main div class inside of the form, which will be the modal content, where we'll change the background and we'll make it a little bit see-through, and we'll also mess with the border radius. So we'll say .modal-content, and let's change the background color to that 434E5A hex value, which gives a similar background color to the background in Sublime Text right here. So as we can see right there. And then the finished version has some opacity to it, so we can see through it a little bit. So we'll say opacity 0.85. So it has about a 15% transparency, and we can see the mountain background behind it a little bit. And then let's add some additional padding off to the left and right, so the input sections aren't all the way off to the side. So we'll say padding 0 top bottom and 18 pixels left right. And then if we refresh, we also want to change the border radius. So let's make it a little more rounded with a border radius of 10 pixels. All right, and then refresh. And then the last thing is there's a weird trick here where it's a little bit blurry around the border, but if we add a border to it, it's going to be a lot sharper. So we're just going to say border 2 pixels, and I'm just going to say black. So in order for the border to show up, we would add important, I believe, but if we just add a border, it might be hard to tell, but it's going to make it sharper around the edges. Okay, so now that we have the modal content class styled, let's drop down to the user image that we see right here with the image inside of it. So that's going to be the div class user image, and then we have the image, as I said, right inside of it. So we'll say .user-image and then img, and let's give it a height and width of 120 pixels, and that will keep it round because we know that it's a square image. And then to move it up, as you see right there, what we'll need to do is add some margin to the class itself. So we'll say margin top -60 pixels, and that's going to move it up. And then to create some space between the image and the first input section, we'll say margin bottom 45 pixels. All right, so now let's go and refresh, and there we have it looking like the original until we get down to the first input section or form group. So let's go ahead and locate that in the HTML so we can move on to styling our input sections. So as we know, they're wrapped with the form group class. So let's go ahead and reference that first, and we'll create some spacing in between the form groups. So we'll say form group margin bottom 25 pixels. So that's going to separate the enter email input, the enter password input, and create a little bit of space underneath the enter password input before we get to the login button as well. So now let's focus on the inputs themselves. So once again, we'll reference the form group class, and then we'll also reference the input tag. So we'll say .form-group and then input. And then let's make them a little bit larger by increasing the height to 42 pixels. And then let's give them a border radius. So we're going to say border radius 5 pixels, which is half that of the modal content. And then let's say border 0 to make sure that it's clear and has sort of a hard line for the border with changing the radius, and then for the font, let's increase the size to 18 pixels. We'll give it a font weight of 600 to make it a little bolder. And that's, of course, inside of the Google font with the weight included already. And then let's change the letter spacing to 2 pixels to space apart the characters a little bit. So as you can see right now, the font is starting to look as it should, but we'll also want to add some padding to the left to make up for space for the icons. So we're going to say padding left 54 pixels. And now we have space to add the font awesome icons to the left of our text inside of the input section. So to add them, what we're going to do is use the same class, the form group class, but we're going to use something called before. And the before selector allows us to insert content before the element. So we're going to reference the font awesome font family, and this is pretty specific. So for the free version of font awesome, it will be font family and then in a single quote, font awesome in capital letters, and then /5 free, because that's the version. And then for the content, we're going to insert the Unicode for this font awesome icon, which in quotes will be /F1FA. And in just a minute, I'm going to show you how you can change the Unicode to a different font awesome icon. So as you can see, we have the @ symbol right there, but then to position it inside of the actual input, we'll say position absolute. And then we'll just need to get it off to the left, so it's to the side of the text. So we're going to say left 28 pixels. So it pushes off left 24 pixels from that section, or 28 rather. And then let's increase the font size to 22 pixels. And then it should be closer. We'll just need to add a little bit of padding to the top to get it centered. So we'll say padding top 4 pixels. And then the last thing that we'll do is just change the color to match the text and the original version. So we're going to say color and hex value 555E60. Okay, so that looks good, except for we want to have the lock icon for the enter password section. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference this same class where it says form-group::before, but in between the form group class and before, we're going to say last of type. So last of type and then before, and that's going to target the last reference of that class. And since we only have 2 references, it's pretty convenient. And then we'll just change the content for that last reference of the class to the Unicode F023 to get the lock symbol. All right, so now let's go and refresh, and there we have the lock. And now if you want to add your own icons, if you go to Font Awesome and then Icons, and you can just do a Google search for icons. Let's just take any random icon here. So here we have the Unicode that we could add. So this one, for example, is F641, where it says add. So if we just change it to that, and then go and refresh our form, there we have the add icon rather than the lock. So I'll just change it back to the lock. And then we can move on to the styling of the login button as we see right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the class for the button, which is going to be the BTN class. But first we'll reference the actual button here inside of the form input so we can add some width and some margin to it. So we'll say form input button, and then let's give it a width of 40%. And then we'll just say, so we're not going to be able to see it yet, but we'll see it in just a few. And then we'll just say margin 5 pixels on the top, 0 left right, and 25 pixels on the bottom. to separate it from the forgot password text. Okay, so now we can go ahead and add the styling to the BTN class for the button. So we have the class BTN right here, and let's go ahead and reference that. So the first thing that we'll do is let's give it the blue background shade, which is the hex value 33698F. And then let's give it a color of white for the actual text inside of it, and we'll increase the font size to 19 pixels. And then we'll also want to make the font bold with the weight of 600. And then let's add the border also. So we have a border of 2 pixels solid white. And let's refresh. And if we toggle back and forth, it looks pretty good, except for the padding doesn't match up exactly. It's a little bit, we'll want a little bit more padding to the top bottom. So we'll say padding 7 pixels top bottom and 14 pixels left right. So left right should stay the same, but we've added some to the top bottom. All right, so now it looks good, except for when we hover over it, we don't have that darker blue shade, and we want to keep the color of the text white. So we'll say BTN hover and then background color, and for the darker blue shade we'll use the hex value 264D69, and then let's just keep the color white. So you can add white, or you can use the hex value FFF. Alright, so now when we hover over it, it looks just like the original, and then all we have left to do is style the forgot password section at the bottom. So let's go ahead and reference that class, and let's just add a little bit of padding around it so it's not pushed up all the way to the bottom. So we'll say padding 5 pixels top, 0 left right, and 25 pixels bottom, similar to what we did with the padding around the button. Alright, so that looks good, except for we'll just want to change the color of the link. So we'll just say forgot A for the anchor text, and then color white. Okay, so that looks good, and then you can always do away with the underline for the forgot password link if you want to, with text decoration none. So that does it for the transparent HTML and CSS login form. I want to thank you for watching. Please remember to like this video, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Then I'll see you in the next video.